The night my front door became the most important door in my story. It was 7 degrees outside and snowing. I remember standing in my foyer, still in my reading sweater, holding a cup of chamomile tea that had gone cold. There was a knock at my door, not a gentle, polite knock, a frantic one, the kind of knock that belongs to someone who has run out of options and is down to their last door. I set the cup down slowly. I walked to the door without rushing, because I had learned, at 72 years old, that urgency is a luxury you offer people who have earned it. I turned on the porch light. I turned the handle. I opened the door. And standing on my welcome mat, in the freezing Ohio dark, were 2 people I had not spoken to in months. One of them was my son, Thaddeus. His collar was turned up against the wind. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, like a man who hadn't slept in days. The other was his wife, the woman who, just months earlier, had sat across from me in a high-end coffee shop in a tailored white pantsuit and told me in the clearest possible terms that I was an embarrassment, that my lifestyle didn't align with their brand, that they were building something great and I simply didn't belong in it. She told me to stay away. She said, and I will never forget these words for as long as I live, "We're better off without you." And tonight, that same woman was standing on my porch, shivering with nowhere else to go, unable to afford a single motel room between the 2 of them. She told me I was an embarrassment. Tonight, she was the one who couldn't afford a roof over her head. I want you to hold that image for just a moment, because what brought 2 people from a multi-million-dollar lifestyle to a freezing porch in the middle of a December night is not a simple story. It is a story about arrogance, about greed, about the kind of cruelty that wears a designer suit and calls itself ambition. But to understand how we got here, you need to go back to the beginning. Here is what I know about pride. It is the most expensive thing a person can own, and most people don't realize what it's costing them until the bill arrives. Have you ever loved someone so completely, given them everything you had, every sacrifice, every late night, every dollar, and watched them look you in the eye and decide you weren't good enough? Have you ever been pushed out of your own family by someone who saw your love as a weakness to be managed? If you have, then you already know exactly how I felt. And if you haven't, pay close attention, because this story is a lesson in what happens when people confuse a mother's patience for a mother's permission. The story you are about to hear is real. The pain was real, and the reckoning, that was more real than anything. Before we go any further, if no one has ever told you that your love has limits worth defending, this channel will. Every story we tell here is proof that quiet dignity hits harder than any argument ever could. Subscribe now, so you never miss the moment the tide turns. My name is Beatrice Vance. I am 72 years old, and I have lived in the same modest, cream-colored house on Sycamore Lane in Dayton, Ohio, for the past 38 years. I know every creak in the floorboards, every draft that sneaks through the kitchen window in January, and exactly which porch step groans when you step on the left side instead of the right. I am not a wealthy woman. I never was. I do not own a yacht or a vacation home or a designer anything. What I own is a small, independent bakery called Vance's Sweet Corner that has stood on the same street corner for 31 years. I own a paid-off house, a reliable car, and a reputation in this town that no amount of money could buy. I built everything I have with 2 hands, a stubborn spine, and a refusal to quit. When my husband, Gerald, passed away from a sudden cardiac event, Thaddeus was only 9 years old. One morning, Gerald was at the breakfast table pouring orange juice, and by that afternoon, he was gone. Just like that. No warning, no goodbye, just an empty chair that I couldn't bring myself to move for the better part of a year. I won't pretend that period didn't break something in me. It did. But I made a promise, standing at Gerald's graveside in the rain with a 9-year-old boy clutching my hand, that Thaddeus would never feel the weight of that absence if I could help it. So I worked. I ran the bakery by day and kept the books for 3 local businesses by night. My hands were always calloused. My back always ached. There were winters where I chose between a new coat and Thaddeus's school supplies, and I chose his school supplies every single time without a second thought. That was simply what mothers did. At least, that was what this mother did. Vance's Sweet Corner was not just a business. It was a heartbeat. Walk through that door on any given morning, and the first thing that hits you is the smell: warm butter, brown sugar, and cinnamon, layered over something deeper and richer that I could never quite name, but that every regular customer said felt like home. The walls were lined with vintage floral wallpaper that I picked out myself in 1994 and refused to change despite every well-meaning suggestion to modernize. The display case ran the full length of the counter, and right in the center, always, was my signature peach cobbler. That cobbler put Thaddeus through 4 years at Ohio State University. It paid his first month's rent. It kept the lights on in this house through 3 recessions and 1 global pandemic. When people in Dayton talked about Vance's, they weren't just talking about pastry. They were talking about 3 decades of showing up. Thaddeus was my greatest accomplishment. Smarter than I ever was, sharper than his father, with a laugh that could fill a room without trying. I watched that boy grow from a quiet, grieving 9-year-old into a confident, educated man, and every step of that journey felt like a personal victory I had earned through every early morning and every late night. We had Sunday dinners every week without fail: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, a pie cooling on the counter. He would sit at the kitchen table and tell me about his week, and I would listen, and the house felt full again in those moments. When he graduated, I was the loudest person in that auditorium. When he needed a down payment for his first condo, I had the check written before he finished asking. I thought we had a bond that nothing in this world could break. I was right about the bond. I was wrong about Thaddeus. Because a bond, I would come to learn, is only as strong as the character of the people holding it. And sometimes the people you love most are capable of a weakness so quiet, so gradual, that by the time you see it clearly, it has already done its damage. But I am getting ahead of myself. First, you need to meet Meredith. Thaddeus called me on a Thursday evening to tell me he was bringing someone special to Sunday dinner. His voice had a particular quality to it, bright, almost performative, like he was practicing how to sound casual. I didn't press him. I simply told him I would make roast chicken and the peach cobbler, and he said, "Perfect, Mom. She's going to love it." She did not love it. Meredith walked through my front door that Sunday afternoon like someone stepping into a building they were already planning to demolish. She was tall, sharply dressed, with the kind of posture that announced itself before she spoke. She was a corporate consultant from a wealthy family on the North Shore of Chicago, old money mixed with new ambition, and absolutely certain that the combination made her superior to most rooms she entered. She entered mine, looked at my vintage floral wallpaper, and wrinkled her nose. Not dramatically, not rudely enough that Thaddeus could call it out. Just enough for me to see it. I had set the table carefully that evening. Good dishes, cloth napkins, the cobbler cooling on the counter in its ceramic dish the way it had for 30 years. When I slid a generous slice onto Meredith's plate and set it in front of her with a smile, she looked at it the way you look at something you'd rather not touch. She pushed the plate aside without tasting it. "I don't consume refined sugars or empty calories," she said, directing the comment at the table rather than at me. Polite enough to be deniable, dismissive enough to land. There was a half-second of silence. And then Thaddeus laughed, that nervous, hollow laugh I had never heard from him before. He reached over, moved the plate further away from her, and said, "Sorry, babe, I should have checked your preferences beforehand." He apologized to her, for my cobbler, in my kitchen. That was the first gut punch. Over the following weeks, the picture of Meredith filled in with sharp, unflattering detail. She came from a family that measured success in zip codes and social circles. Her father ran a prominent investment firm in Chicago. Her mother sat on the boards of 2 cultural foundations. Meredith herself had built a career as a high-powered corporate consultant, advising executives on brand positioning and public image, which meant she had spent her entire professional life deciding who and what was worth being associated with. She had applied that same clinical eye to my son. And somewhere in that process, she had looked at me, the bakery, the floral wallpaper, the calloused hands, the cream-colored house on Sycamore Lane, and made a quiet, calculated decision about my value. I simply didn't know it yet. It didn't happen all at once. That is the thing about this kind of slow removal. It is designed to feel reasonable at every individual step, so that by the time you see the full pattern, you are already halfway erased. The Sunday dinners became bi-weekly. Thaddeus always had a reasonable explanation: a work commitment, a prior engagement, a weekend trip with Meredith's family. Then bi-weekly became once a month. Then once a month became a vague, unfulfilled promise to find a time that works. The phone calls changed too. Where Thaddeus once called freely, now he called quickly. Short sentences, clipped answers, a distracted energy, like a man conducting two conversations at once, one with me, and one with whoever was in the room watching him talk to me. I noticed. I said nothing. I kept the cobbler warm and the porch light on, and I waited. The evening it became undeniable. Thaddeus called me on a Wednesday night. He sounded rehearsed, the way people sound when they have been coached on what to say. "Meredith thinks we need to establish healthier boundaries, Mom," he said. "She feels like our relationship is a little codependent." I held the phone for a moment before I answered. Codependent. A clinical word, carefully chosen. The kind of word that reframes a mother's love as a problem requiring management. "Thaddeus," I said quietly, "I call you because I love you. That is not codependency. That is family." I know, he said, his voice dropping lower. "But she's my fiancée now, Beatrice. Her feelings have to come first." Beatrice. Not Mom, not even Mother. Beatrice. I felt it like a physical blow landed somewhere between my ribs and my stomach. I knew, in that instant, exactly whose voice had rehearsed that sentence. And I knew that my son had let her put it in his mouth without a single word of resistance. I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not guilt him or remind him of every sacrifice I had ever made. I simply said, "I understand," and I let him go. Because some things cannot be won with words. They can only be waited out. Have you ever had someone slowly erase you from your own family, one small step at a time? Drop a comment below. You are not alone in this. I told myself I could live with the distance. I told myself that young marriages needed space and that Thaddeus would find his footing. But none of that, not the cold Sunday dinners, not the whispered phone calls, not the word Beatrice. None of it prepared me for what Meredith did 2 weeks before the wedding. 2 weeks before the wedding, Meredith requested a private meeting. Not Thaddeus, Meredith alone. She sent the message through Thaddeus, which told me everything I needed to know about the nature of what was coming. A woman who wanted a genuine conversation would have called herself. A woman running an operation sends an intermediary. The location she chose was a high-end coffee shop in downtown Dayton, the kind of place with exposed brick walls, $12 lattes, and staff who greet you by name if your credit card is black. It was a deliberate choice. Neutral ground that wasn't neutral at all, because it was her kind of place, not mine. I arrived 15 minutes early. I wore my best Sunday dress, a deep navy with small pearl buttons down the front that I had owned for years and kept for occasions that deserved it. I sat down, folded my hands on the table, and I waited. She arrived 15 minutes late. Not apologetically late, deliberately late. The kind of late that announces, your time is not as valuable as mine. She walked through the door in a tailored white pantsuit that looked like it cost more than my monthly grocery bill for a year. Designer sunglasses pushed up on her head despite being indoors. Not a hair displaced. Not a single visible crack in the composure. She spotted me, walked over without hurrying, and sat down across from me without a greeting. No hello, Beatrice. No thank you for coming. She didn't signal the server. She didn't invite me to order anything. She simply settled into the chair, adjusted her sunglasses on top of her head, and looked at me the way a person looks at an agenda item they want to get through quickly. The temperature at that table dropped the moment she sat down. "Let's not play games, Beatrice," she said. Her voice was smooth, measured, and entirely without warmth. The practiced tone of someone who delivers difficult news to clients for a living and has learned to make cruelty sound reasonable. I said nothing. I kept my hands folded on the table, my back straight, my face open. I had learned long ago that silence is its own kind of power, and I intended to make her use every word herself. She had clearly prepared. She reached into that preparation now with the confidence of someone who had already decided how this conversation would end. "Thaddeus is entering a new social stratum," she began. "My father is bringing him into the family firm. He's going to be working with serious people, moving in serious circles. That means he needs to look the part, act the part, and be surrounded by the right kind of people." The right kind of people. I let the phrase sit in the air between us without touching it. "And I suppose his own mother isn't the right kind of person?" I asked. My voice was steady. My hands were not. I pressed them harder against each other under the table where she couldn't see. "To put it plainly," she tilted her head slightly, and the thin smile that crossed her face did not reach her eyes by even a fraction. "No." She continued without missing a beat. "Your background, your little bakery, your lifestyle, none of it aligns with the image we are building for our future family. Thaddeus is too polite to say this to you directly, but we have discussed it at length." She paused to let that land. "We have discussed it," meaning my son had sat in a room with this woman and agreed that I was a liability. "You are an embarrassment to him now, Beatrice. I think, deep down, you already know that. We feel it would be best if you took a significant step back from our lives. No unannounced visits. Fewer phone calls." She wasn't finished. She leaned forward just slightly, dropping her voice to a register that felt almost intimate in its cruelty. "Frankly, we would prefer you didn't attend the wedding. Your presence would make things awkward for the other guests. The kind of people who will be in that room, Beatrice, they are not your crowd. It would be uncomfortable for everyone, and honestly, it would reflect poorly on Thaddeus." She sat back, smoothed the front of her jacket with one hand, and then she delivered the line with the calm finality of someone closing a business deal they have already won. "Stay away from us. We are better off without you." The words settled into the quiet hum of the coffee shop. "We are better off without you." I waited for the tears to come. I had cried at Gerald's funeral. I had cried when Thaddeus left for university. I was not a woman who withheld tears when they were earned. But they didn't come. What came instead was something I had never felt quite so cleanly before. A cold, absolute clarity, the kind that arrives when every illusion has been stripped away, and all that remains is the bare truth of a situation. I looked at Meredith. I looked at her carefully, the way you look at something you are seeing for the very last time and want to remember accurately. I saw no hesitation in her eyes, no flicker of guilt, no humanity extended in my direction. I took a slow sip of my water. I set the glass down without a sound. I looked her directly in the eyes. And I said one word. "Okay." She blinked. It was the first uncontrolled thing she had done since she walked through that door. A single, involuntary blink, the physical signal of a mind that had just received information it wasn't prepared for. She had come to this coffee shop expecting a performance. She wanted tears, or begging, or an argument she could later recount to Thaddeus as evidence of my instability. She had a whole architecture built around my reaction, and I had just removed the foundation from under it with a single syllable. I stood up, I picked up my purse. I pushed my chair in quietly. And I walked out, leaving her alone at that table with every word she had just said. She thought she had dismissed me. She thought that meeting was the end of something. She had no idea it was the beginning. Don't go anywhere, because what came next, she never saw coming. Some people say I should have fought harder in that coffee shop. Others say that one word, "okay," was the most powerful thing I could have said. What do you think? Tell me in the comments. I want to know where you stand. The morning of Thaddeus's wedding, I woke up at 5:30, the same time I had woken up every day for the past 30 years. I lay in bed for exactly 2 minutes, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of the day press down on me, and then, deliberately, consciously, lifting it off. I had made a decision. I had given my word. and I intended to honor both with every hour of that Saturday. I made my coffee. I pulled on my gardening clothes, the old tan trousers with the dirt-stained knees and the faded green shirt that Gerald had bought me the summer before he passed. I laced up my work boots. I took my coffee out to the back porch, stood in the cool September morning air, and looked at the garden that had been waiting for my attention all week. Then I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. There is something deeply honest about garden work. It does not ask you how you feel. It does not offer you sympathy or platitudes. It simply requires your hands, your attention, and your willingness to show up, and in return, it gives you something living and real. I pulled weeds from the bed along the back fence until my fingers ached pleasantly. I turned the soil around the rose bushes that Gerald had planted the year we moved into this house. And then I did something I had been planning for weeks. I planted lavender along the south-facing border, pressing each small root into the dark earth with my thumbs and patting the soil firm around it. The smell was clean and soft and completely indifferent to the occasion. The September light that morning had a particular quality, pale gold, long-shadowed, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look considered. It fell across my garden and my hands and my old green shirt, and I let it. I did not check my phone, not once. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. I did not check social media. I did not drive past the venue. I did not call a single mutual friend to ask how it was going. I had told Meredith I would stay away, and I stayed away, completely, without exception, and without the passive-aggressive half-measures that would have made my absence a statement rather than a promise kept. My word has always been the cleanest thing I own. I was not about to dirty it over people who had already demonstrated that theirs meant nothing at all. I planted lavender, I drank my coffee, I let the day pass. The reports came in the following week, the way reports always do in a town like Dayton, through the gentle, unstoppable current of people who know people who know people. It was a grand affair by all accounts. A ballroom downtown, 240 guests, most of whom Thaddeus had never met before that evening, Meredith's father's business associates, investors, people whose names appeared in financial columns, a string quartet, an open bar that reportedly stayed open far too long. My absence was explained, I was told, as a health issue. A vague, dignified excuse that asked no follow-up questions. One woman who had known our family for years sent me a photograph from the reception, Thaddeus at the head table, handsome in his tuxedo, smiling for the camera with his eyes pointed somewhere just past it. Distant, performed. And at the family table, clearly visible in the background, one empty chair. I will not pretend that photograph didn't cost me something. I sat with it at my kitchen table for a long time that evening. I felt the grief of it, genuinely, fully, without dressing it up as anything other than what it was. A mother missing her son's wedding, a chair where she should have been sitting, a day she would never get back. But I did not perform it. I did not call anyone. I did not post anything. I simply felt it, and then I folded it away somewhere private and I moved forward. I had given my word, and unlike the people in that ballroom, my word still meant something. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into the bakery with a focus I hadn't felt in years. I finalized a wholesale contract with a regional supermarket chain that I had been negotiating for months. I hired 2 additional staff. I repainted the storefront a warm cream with sage green trim. My bank account grew healthier. My back porch smelled of new lavender. My heart was still healing, but it was healing forward, not backward, and that made all the difference. 3 months passed without a single word from my son. Not a text, not a voicemail, not a birthday call, and my birthday fell on the 14th of October, a date Thaddeus had never once forgotten in his entire life. I had always received a call before 8 in the morning, his voice still rough with sleep, singing an off-key version of Happy Birthday that made me laugh every single time. That October 14th, my phone was quiet from morning until night. I made my own birthday cake, a small lemon pound cake with cream cheese frosting, and I ate a slice at the kitchen table alone with a cup of tea. I did not cry. I did not call him. I sat with the silence and I let it tell me exactly what it needed to tell me. Dead to them, that was the truth of it. I want to be honest with you, because this story deserves honesty more than it deserves performance. The grief during those 3 months was real. There were evenings when I would pass Thaddeus's old bedroom and feel the absence of him like a cold draft through a room with no open windows. There were Sunday afternoons when the house was too quiet and the silence had a particular texture that pressed against the walls. But alongside that grief, growing steadily and without apology, was something else entirely: clarity. I was not confused about what had happened. I was not wondering if I had somehow caused it. The picture was sharp and honest, and I could see every detail of it without flinching. That clarity was its own strange comfort, and the bakery gave me somewhere to put my hands while my heart did its quiet work. It was a Tuesday evening in mid-December when everything shifted. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, the heavy, determined kind that drums against the kitchen window and turns the street outside into a long, dark mirror. I was at the kitchen table with the bakery's quarterly accounts spread in front of me, a half-eaten bowl of vegetable soup going cold at my elbow. My phone, face down on the counter beside the stove, buzzed once. I didn't move immediately. Notifications at that hour were usually supplier emails or the occasional message from one of my staff. I finished the line of figures I was working through, capped my pen, and reached for it. The name on the screen stopped me completely. Not Thaddeus. Meredith. I stood at the counter for a moment, phone in hand, reading her name on the screen the way you read something you need to read twice before it fully registers. Then I set the phone back down, face up, and watched it ring through to voicemail without answering. 14 seconds of ringing, then silence. Then, almost immediately after, the small double vibration of an incoming text message. I picked up the phone and read it. Hi, Beatrice. I know it's been a while. We've hit a bit of a tight spot financially and things are really essential right now. Would you be able to send $3,000? It would mean a lot. Thanks. I read it once, then I read it again. Then I set the phone face down on the counter, walked to the stove, picked up my soup, and stood at the kitchen window watching the rain hit the glass for a full minute before I trusted myself to react. Because what I felt in that moment was not anger. It was a laugh, a slow, quiet, utterly genuine laugh, rising up from somewhere deep in my chest. Essential. She had used the word essential. The audacity of that message was staggering on its surface. But what I didn't know yet, what none of us knew yet, was why they couldn't simply ask Meredith's wealthy, well-connected father for the money. Why, with all that family wealth and all those important connections, the only option available to them was a text to the woman they had declared themselves better off without. That answer would come, and when it did, it changed everything. In a town like Dayton, information travels. Not maliciously, just naturally, the way water finds the lowest ground. And over the 3 months of silence, enough of it had found its way to me that I had a reasonably clear picture of what life actually looked like inside that Chicago penthouse. Thaddeus had not, as Meredith had implied during our Sunday dinners, stepped into a position of significance at her father's firm. He had not been handed a corner office or a meaningful title or any of the quiet power that had been suggested when the subject of his future career came up in conversation. He had started at the bottom. Not as a partner, not as a senior associate. As a junior analyst, a glorified intern with a respectable title and a salary that reflected exactly where he stood in that organization, which was entry level. He was being watched, assessed, and managed like any other new hire, with the added pressure of being the boss's son-in-law and all the scrutiny that position carried with it. The grand career Meredith had outlined for him was, at present, a starting point dressed up as an arrival. The apartment they were living in, however, reflected none of that reality. A luxury penthouse in the River North neighborhood of downtown Chicago, floor-to-ceiling windows, a building with a doorman, a rooftop terrace, and a monthly rent figure that, when I was told it by a mutual acquaintance who had visited them shortly after the wedding, made me set down my coffee cup and stare at the wall for a moment. $4,800 a month. On a junior analyst's salary and I am being generous here, covered perhaps half of that figure on a good month, before taxes, before the car payments on the 2 vehicles they were leasing, before the restaurant tabs and the wardrobe maintenance and the social calendar that Meredith's circle demanded. The numbers did not add up. They had never added up. Someone had been quietly filling the gap between the life they were performing and the income they were actually earning, and that arrangement had clearly just reached its limit. Here is what people outside that world do not fully understand. In certain social circles, the appearance of wealth is not optional. It is the price of admission, and it must be paid continuously or the doors close. Meredith's circle was that kind of circle. Charity galas, weekend trips to Lake Geneva, dinners at restaurants where the menu had no prices, clothing that announced its own value without a label visible to anyone outside the room. These were not occasional indulgences. They were the baseline, the minimum required to remain credible in the environment she had grown up in and refused to leave behind. Thaddeus, who had grown up eating peach cobbler at a kitchen table in Dayton, Ohio, had been inserted into this world and expected to perform it convincingly. And for a while, with enough financial cushioning and enough determination, he had. But cushioning has a bottom, and they had just hit it. The obvious question is, why me? Why send that text to a woman you had declared yourself better off without, when Meredith's own father was a wealthy man with deep pockets and a direct interest in his daughter's comfort? The answer, when it came to me, was as revealing as anything else in this story. Meredith's father was not a soft man. He was a self-made, exacting, deeply proud individual who had built his firm on discipline and expected the same from the people around him. He had agreed to bring Thaddeus into the organization as a professional courtesy to his daughter, but that courtesy came with an unspoken condition: perform or face the consequences. Going to him with a cash shortfall would have been an admission of failure. It would have triggered judgment, lectures, and very possibly a reduction in Thaddeus's already fragile standing at the firm. It was not an option they were willing to take. So they looked for a softer target. And that is where I came in. Me, the bakery owner from Dayton with the floral wallpaper and the calloused hands. The embarrassment. The woman who didn't align with the brand. The one they had removed from their lives with the clean efficiency of a business decision. In their calculation, I was still the same woman who had written the check for Thaddeus's university fees without being asked twice. The same woman who had handed over a down payment for his condo with nothing but love and a hug at the door. They had pushed me out of their lives, but they had assumed, without ever questioning that assumption, that my unconditional love would survive the pushing. They assumed I was a safety net they could spit on and still fall into. That was their single greatest miscalculation. They forgot something fundamental. When they pushed me away, they pushed away everything that came with me. The support, the resources, the open door, the check written without hesitation. You cannot exile someone from your life and then reach back in for the parts of them that were convenient. That is not how dignity works, and it is not how I work. We have all known someone who only calls when they need something. Comment yes below if you have been there. You are in good company. I sat with that text message for exactly as long as it deserved. Then I picked up my phone, and I typed my reply with the same careful, deliberate energy that Meredith had brought to that coffee shop table 4 months earlier. Don't go anywhere. What I texted back, they were absolutely not ready for it. I have never been a woman who fires off responses in the heat of the moment. Gerald used to say that my greatest weapon was my patience, that I could outlast any argument simply by refusing to be rushed. He was right. And that Tuesday evening, standing at my kitchen window with the rain still working at the glass, I took my time. I picked up the phone. I opened Meredith's message and read it one more time, not because I had forgotten it, but because I wanted every word of it fresh in my mind when I composed my response. Tight spot. Essential, would you be able to? I thought about the white pantsuit. I thought about the wrinkling nose at my peach cobbler. I thought about the word embarrassment delivered across a coffee shop table without a single tremor of remorse. Then I typed my reply. 8 words. No punctuation games, no dramatics, no cruelty beyond the plain truth of it. Better off also means without my money. I read it once, I pressed send. Then I set the phone face up on the counter, poured myself a fresh cup of tea, and stood back. For approximately 10 seconds, nothing happened. The kitchen was quiet except for the rain and the low hum of the refrigerator. 10 seconds of complete stillness, the kind that exists in the breath between a stone leaving your hand and the sound of it hitting water. Then the phone screen lit up. And it did not stop lighting up for the next 45 minutes. The first message arrived 40 seconds after I hit send. It was from Meredith. "Excuse me, are you serious right now?" Then, before I could have responded even if I had wanted to. "This is incredibly immature, Beatrice. We came to you in good faith." Good faith. I set the phone down and let that one sit. Then Thaddeus's number appeared. His messages had a different quality, less controlled than Meredith's, more frantic, the words of a man caught between two forces he no longer had the strength to manage. "Mom, please, this isn't the time for this. We're really struggling right now. I know things haven't been great between us, but please." Then Meredith again, and the temperature of her messages had dropped several degrees further. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? This is your son's credit score on the line, his entire financial future. Don't be vindictive, it's beneath you." I almost laughed at that one. Beneath me. From the woman who had told me I was beneath her wedding guest list. Then, escalating further. "If we get evicted from this apartment, that is on you. You will have done that to your own son. I hope you can live with that." I read every message. I responded to none of them. I stood at that counter, and I read each one with the steady, unhurried attention of a woman who had already made her decision and had nothing left to prove to anyone in that thread. At 9:17 in the evening, the messages stopped, and the phone began to ring. "Thaddeus." I looked at his name on the screen for 2 full rings. Then I answered, and I said nothing. I simply held the phone to my ear and waited, because I had learned that the person with the most to say should be the first one to say it. He spoke within 3 seconds. His voice was not the voice of the confident, sharp young man I had raised. It was the voice of someone who had been running hard for a long time and had just hit a wall. "Mom," he said it like the word itself was an apology, drawn out and exhausted. "Mom, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. Things have gotten out of hand and we need help. I know we haven't been in contact and I know it wasn't right, okay? I'm sorry about that. I just need you to not do this right now. I need you to help us." I listened to every word. Here is what I noticed. He was sorry about the timing. He was sorry about the inconvenience of the distance between us at the precise moment they needed something from me. He was sorry things had gotten out of hand, a passive construction that assigned responsibility to no one, least of all himself. He was not sorry for the coffee shop, not sorry for the word Beatrice, not sorry for the empty chair at the wedding table, or the birthday that passed without a call, or the 90 days of silence that preceded this phone call by exactly the amount of time it took them to run out of other options. When he finished, I waited 1 beat, then I spoke. "Thaddeus," I said, "I love you. That has not changed and it will not change. But love is not the same as a checking account with no withdrawal limit." "Mom, please." "I am not finished." My voice was level. No heat in it, no tears, no wavering. Gerald used to call it my frozen lake voice, the tone I saved for moments when emotion would cost more than it was worth. "You made a series of choices over the past year. You chose to end our Sunday dinners. You chose to stop calling. You chose not to acknowledge my birthday. You chose to allow your wife to ask me to stay away from your wedding. I respected every single one of those choices, Thaddeus. I stayed away, exactly as requested." Silence on his end. "When you chose your wife's boundaries," I said, "you chose her bank account too. I am simply honoring the arrangement you designed." He said my name one more time, "Mom," and it cracked slightly on the single syllable, and I felt the crack of it land somewhere in my chest where it would leave a mark regardless of how right I knew I was. "Good night, Thaddeus," I said. "I hope things improve for you." And I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the kitchen table. I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. I sat down in my chair at the kitchen table, the same chair I had sat in for 38 years, at the same table where I had written every check, signed every form, and made every sacrifice. I did not cry. I just sat, still and quiet as the room around me. Now I know what some of you are thinking. You expected me to fold. If you have been following this story from the beginning, you know that I spent 40 years saying yes. Yes to the extra shift. Yes to the school fees. Yes to the down payment. Yes to the Sunday dinners nobody else was making. 40 years of yes, given freely, without a ledger, without expectation. So it would be reasonable to assume that one desperate phone call from my son would undo all of it. But here is what 40 years of saying yes also teaches you, if you are paying attention. It teaches you exactly what your love is worth. It teaches you the difference between a person who receives your love with gratitude and a person who receives it as a given, as a utility, like electricity, that they expect to keep flowing regardless of how they treat the source. I knew my worth, and I had finally decided to stop discounting it. After that phone call, I made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a natural conclusion. I put my phone on silent every evening at 7 o'clock. Not out of bitterness. I want to be precise about that distinction, because it matters to me. Bitterness is a secondary wound you inflict on yourself while trying to inflict it on someone else. What I felt was not bitterness. It was boundary. A clean, clear, unambiguous line drawn not in anger but in self-respect. The messages continued for a while. They came in clusters, sometimes 3 in an evening, sometimes a single message that sat unread until morning. Thaddeus. Meredith. Once, a number I didn't recognize that I suspected belonged to someone in Meredith's family, though I never confirmed it. I read none of them. I responded to none of them. I went to bed each night at a reasonable hour and slept without difficulty. By the 3rd week of January, the messages had thinned considerably. By February, they had stopped almost entirely. That is the thing about people who reach out only from desperation. Once they locate another solution, or resign themselves to the absence of one, the reaching stops. The silence on their end was not reconciliation. It was not reflection. It was simply the sound of people who had found another way to manage, at least temporarily, and had moved on to managing it. I noticed the quiet without celebrating it. I simply registered it the way you register a change in weather, as information, neither good nor bad, just true. It was my distant cousin Loretta who kept me informed, and I will be grateful to Loretta for the rest of my natural life. Not because I was hungry for bad news, but because the information she passed along helped me understand the full shape of what was happening. Loretta lived on the north side of Chicago and moved, professionally, in circles that occasionally overlapped with Meredith's family's sphere. She called me on a Sunday afternoon in late February with the careful, measured tone of someone delivering news they aren't sure you want, but believe you need. There had been no eviction. They had managed to keep the apartment, but the cost of doing so had been considerable. The wedding gift envelopes, the cash gifts, the checks had been quietly liquidated in the weeks following the wedding to cover the December shortfall. A high-interest personal loan had appeared shortly after that, taken from a private lender rather than a bank, which told its own story about the state of their credit at that point. The pristine image was showing its first, thin fractures. Loretta also mentioned, almost as an aside, that Meredith had quietly withdrawn from 2 of the social committees she had joined after the wedding, the kind of volunteer board positions that exist primarily as networking platforms for a certain class of Chicago society woman. The official reason given was a demanding work schedule. The actual reason, Loretta suspected, was the cost of participation. The fundraising galas, the charity luncheons, the silent auction commitments that came with those positions, and that added up to amounts that were no longer comfortable. The white pantsuit was still being worn. The sunglasses were still designer. But the scaffolding that held the image upright was being quietly, methodically dismantled behind it, one liquidated asset and one declined invitation at a time. While all of this was happening in Chicago, I was in Dayton doing what I had always done, working. The supermarket contract I had signed in the autumn was now in full operation, with Vance's Sweet Corner products appearing on 3 regional store shelves under a new wholesale label I had designed myself. I had taken on a part-time bookkeeper so I could redirect my evenings away from accounts and toward the recipe development I had been postponing for years. I repainted the interior of the bakery for the first time in a decade. The same warm cream, the same floral wallpaper, unchanged and unapologetic. My life was moving forward with a quiet momentum that felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely my own. I have never been a woman who believed in sitting back and waiting for the universe to sort things out. I believe in work, in choices, in the direct relationship between what you put in and what you get back. But I will say this, karma doesn't always knock politely at the door. Sometimes it doesn't knock at all. Sometimes it simply tears the whole house down. And in the spring of that year, I attended a business convention in Chicago that would show me exactly what that looked like. In the second week of April, I traveled to Chicago for the Midwest Small Business Expo, an annual convention I had attended 3 times previously and had found genuinely useful for the kind of practical, unglamorous business development that keeps a small operation growing steadily rather than spectacularly. This particular year, I had 2 specific goals. I wanted to meet with a packaging supplier about redesigning the wholesale line's exterior branding, and I wanted to sit in on a session about regional distribution contracts that a colleague from Columbus had recommended. Nothing dramatic, nothing personal, pure business. I had not thought about Thaddeus or Meredith in any sustained way for several weeks. Chicago was their city, not mine, and I had made my peace with that geography. I booked a modest hotel room 2 blocks from the convention center, packed a sensible bag, and arrived on a Wednesday morning ready to work. The last thing I was expecting was to have my world rearranged over a cup of tea in a hotel lobby. On the second afternoon of the convention, I finished an early session and stopped in the lobby of the Convention Center Hotel for a cup of tea before my 4 o'clock meeting. The lobby was the kind of space that exists in every large business hotel: high ceilings, neutral furnishings, the low murmur of professional conversations happening at a dozen tables simultaneously. I found an armchair near the window, ordered my tea, and opened my notebook to review the questions I had prepared for the packaging supplier. I was not paying attention to the table immediately to my left. There was no reason to. 3 men in suits, speaking in the measured, technical cadence of people discussing numbers, the kind of conversation that blends into the background of any business environment without demanding notice. I was on my second page of notes when I heard a name that stopped my pen completely. Hargrove Capital Management. Meredith's father's firm. I did not move. I did not look up. I set my teacup down with the kind of careful, deliberate stillness that you deploy when you need the people around you to believe you are not listening. The 3 men at the adjacent table were not being reckless. They were speaking at a normal conversational volume, the way professionals speak when they believe they are among peers and strangers in the room are occupied with their own concerns. They had no reason to guard their words around a 72-year-old woman in a sensible blazer, reviewing notes in a convention hotel lobby. So they didn't. And I listened to every word with the focused, unblinking attention of a woman who understood, instinctively, that what she was hearing mattered. From what I could piece together, the 3 men were financial compliance auditors, not from Hargrove Capital itself, but from an external firm that had been brought in, it seemed, at the request of someone with an interest in understanding the full picture before the picture became public. The phrase that landed first was delivered quietly, almost casually, by the man closest to me. The whole structure is a house of cards. What followed, in the careful, technical language of their profession, was a description of a financial operation that had long since crossed the line from aggressive into fraudulent. New client funds being cycled through to cover dividend payments owed to older clients. Numbers on paper that did not reflect numbers in accounts. A regulatory body, federal, not state, that had been building a case for the better part of 18 months and was, according to what I overheard, planning to move before the end of the calendar year. Hargrove Capital Management, the firm that Meredith had spoken of with such unshakable pride, the institution whose name had been used to justify my removal from my son's life, was, by every indication these men offered, a financial fraud operation in its final months of operation. And then one of the other men said something that turned the temperature of that lobby, for me, several degrees colder. He mentioned compliance documentation. Specifically, he referenced a junior staff member whose name had been placed on several internal compliance reports, the kind of positioning that, in a legitimate operation, signals oversight responsibility, but in a fraudulent one, signals something else entirely, a name to absorb consequence if the structure collapses. He didn't say the name aloud. He referenced a title and a tenure length that were unmistakably consistent with one person's timeline at that firm. My son's. Thaddeus had been at Hargrove Capital for less than a year. He had been brought in through a family connection. He had started at the bottom, and somewhere in that organization, someone had placed his name on documents that he almost certainly did not fully understand, making him, in the eyes of federal investigators, a potential point of liability in a case he had no idea was coming. I felt it immediately and physically, the mother's instinct, rising fast and urgent from somewhere that has no address, but that every parent knows the location of. I wanted to call him, right there in that hotel lobby, with my tea going cold and my notebook open on my knee. I wanted to dial his number and tell him to walk out of that building immediately, to get his name off every document he could find, to hire a lawyer before the week was out. For approximately 30 seconds, I sat with that impulse at full strength. My hand was on my phone. My thumb was on his name in my contacts. 30 seconds of pure maternal instinct, raw and urgent and entirely genuine. And then I remembered. I remembered her eyes across the coffee shop table, flat, certain, and without a trace of warmth. I remembered the word embarrassment, delivered with the calm efficiency of a woman who had rehearsed it. I remembered Beatrice, spoken by my own son, in a voice coached into unfamiliarity. I remembered the empty chair at the wedding table, the birthday that passed without a call, the text message that opened with no greeting and closed with no gratitude and asked for $3,000 in between. They had made their position clear. They had asked me, explicitly and without ambiguity, to stay out of their lives. I put my phone back in my bag. I picked up my teacup. I chose to honor their request, completely and in full. I finished my tea. I attended my 4 o'clock meeting. I spoke with the packaging supplier about branding options for 45 minutes and made 2 pages of useful notes. And on the train back to my hotel that evening, I sat by the window and watched the Chicago skyline pass in the dark, and I thought, the dominoes are already lined up. Every single one of them. All that was needed now was the push. And I would not be the one doing the pushing. By the first week of December, my life had settled into a rhythm that felt genuinely good. The bakery's holiday season was in full operation, the display case running double capacity, the wholesale orders filling the back counter every morning before 6, the smell of cinnamon and pine and brown butter moving through the shop and out onto the street in a way that made people slow their walk as they passed the window. I had decorated the storefront with simple white lights and a fresh pine wreath on the door, the same way I had done every December for 30 years. On the evening of the 9th, I finished the closing count at the bakery, drove home through the cold, changed into my housecoat, made a pot of chamomile tea, and settled into my armchair in front of the television with the quiet contentment of a woman whose life was, by any honest measure, working. I turned on the evening news. The regular broadcast had been running for perhaps 4 minutes when the screen shifted. The red breaking news banner appeared at the bottom of the screen with the particular urgency that those banners carry. The visual shorthand that tells you, before a single word is spoken, that something has changed in the world while you were going about your evening. The anchor's tone shifted to match it. Federal agents had executed a raid earlier that day on the downtown Chicago offices of Hargrove Capital Management. The charges, as the anchor read them in the careful, measured cadence of someone reading from a legal document, were substantial. Wire fraud, grand larceny, embezzlement, and the deliberate misappropriation of client investment funds. The investigation, the anchor noted, had been ongoing for nearly 2 years. I set my teacup down on the side table without looking away from the screen. The figures the anchor cited were not modest. Across a client base that spanned 14 states, an estimated $47 million in investment assets had been deliberately misrepresented, redirected, or had simply ceased to exist in any recoverable form. Retirement accounts, college funds, the life savings of people who had trusted a firm with a prestigious name and a polished office and a founder who had known how to dress for the part. Real people with real lives who had handed their financial futures to a man who had spent years treating their trust as a personal resource. Meredith's father appeared on screen briefly, a file photo, the kind taken at a corporate event, showing a well-dressed man in his 60s with the particular expression of someone who has spent decades being deferred to. He did not look powerful in that photograph anymore. The broadcast cut to footage taken outside the building earlier that afternoon, the standard visual of a federal operation in progress. Agents in jackets. A line of employees filing out of the building's main entrance into the cold Chicago afternoon, some carrying personal belongings, some with nothing, all of them wearing the particular expression of people whose understanding of their own lives had just fundamentally shifted. The reporter's voice continued over the footage, nomming senior executives who had been taken in for questioning, describing the scope of the federal team involved. And then, the reporter said what she called the final detail that underscored the reach of the investigation: that family members and junior associates connected to the firm were also being brought in for questioning regarding compliance documentation that investigators believed had been used to obscure the operation's internal structure. The camera swept across the employees still filing out. And there, walking 3 people behind Meredith's father, collar up, face pale and drawn with a fear I recognized even at television resolution, was my son. What followed in the days after the raid was swift, comprehensive, and entirely without mercy. Hargrove Capital's assets were frozen within 24 hours of the raid. The firm's accounts, its holdings, its operational funds, all of it locked pending the federal investigation. This meant that every salary that had been scheduled to process at the end of the month did not process. Every expense account went dark. Every corporate card stopped working at the exact moment it was swiped. The luxury penthouse in River North, the $4,800 a month apartment with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the doorman, was locked by the building's management within 72 hours of Thaddeus and Meredith falling behind on their suddenly unmanageable rent, with no income arriving to cover it. Their personal vehicles, both leased and both payments now missed, were repossessed within the week. The image that had required so much maintenance, so much performance, so much deliberate construction, it did not fade gradually. It came down all at once, like a wall that had been holding water. Thaddeus spent the better part of a week in deposition rooms. I learned this through Loretta, who had reliable sources and the good judgment to deliver information plainly and without embellishment. Federal investigators had initially flagged his name because of the compliance documents, the same documents I had heard referenced in that hotel lobby 8 months earlier. On paper, his signature and his title created the appearance of oversight responsibility for processes he had almost certainly never been shown in full. The investigation ultimately concluded what I had suspected from the moment I heard his tenure length mentioned by those auditors. Thaddeus was not an architect of the fraud. He was a name on a page, placed there by people who understood exactly what they were doing and had positioned him accordingly. His intent was cleared. His involvement in the criminal sense did not result in charges. But cleared of criminal intent is not the same as unaffected. His name had appeared in federal fraud proceedings. In the finance industry, that is a mark that does not wash off regardless of the outcome. The firm he had worked for was gone. His professional references were either under investigation or in the process of distancing themselves from everything connected to Hargrove Capital with considerable speed. The network Meredith had promised him, the connections, the advancement, the social infrastructure of her father's world, had dissolved overnight along with everything else. He was 29 years old, unemployed, blacklisted from the industry he had been building toward, and buried under personal debt that had been accumulating since the wedding. I watched all of it unfold from my armchair in Dayton, Ohio. The fireplace was going. The holiday bakery orders were stacked neatly on the kitchen counter for the morning. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine and the particular warmth of a home that has been properly, consistently cared for over many years. My life, the modest, calloused hands, floral wallpaper life that had been deemed an embarrassment, was intact, solvent, and quietly thriving. Outside, the first snow of December was coming down in the kind of slow, steady way that makes the world go still. Inside, I sat with my tea, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Complete, uncomplicated peace. I need you to sit with what I just described for a moment. The child you worked 2 jobs to support. The boy whose school supplies you chose over your own winter coat. The young man whose university fees came from 3 decades of peach cobbler and early mornings. Walking out of a building with federal investigators at his back, not because of anything you did, but because of every choice he made the moment he decided your love was no longer useful to him. That is what I watched on my television screen that December evening. Don't look away now, because what happened at my front door that night, you need to hear every word of it. It was the 14th of December, 5 days after the news broadcast, when they came. I had spent the evening doing what I had been doing every December evening for 31 years, preparing the next morning's bakery orders. The kitchen table was covered in parchment paper, order sheets, and the quiet industry of a woman who had built something real with her hands and intended to keep it running. The snow had started around 6 in the evening and had been falling steadily since, the kind of clean, heavy snowfall that muffles the world outside and makes the inside of a warm house feel like the only place that exists. I had just set the timer on the oven when the knocking started. Not a gentle knock, not a measured, polite knock. The frantic, open-palmed knocking of someone standing in the cold who has run completely out of alternatives and is down to their very last door. I knew, before I moved a single step, who was on the other side of it. I turned the oven timer off. I smoothed the front of my cardigan with both hands, a habit so old I barely notice it anymore, the physical act of composing yourself before you walk into something that requires your full presence. I checked that my house slippers were on properly. I walked from the kitchen, through the hallway, to the front door at the pace of a woman who had nowhere urgent to be and nothing left to fear. I paused at the door. The knocking came again, harder this time, more desperate, the sound of cold hands and colder circumstances. I reached up and turned on the porch light. I watched the glow spread across the welcome mat through the narrow side window beside the door frame. Then I turned the handle and opened it wide. The man standing on my porch was my son. I say that plainly because I want you to understand that I recognized him completely, not just his face, but the particular way his shoulders carried weight, the set of his jaw, the expression in his eyes that I had been reading since he was 9 years old. I knew him. But the confidence was gone. The collar of a coat that was not warm enough for the weather was turned up against the wind. His eyes were red-rimmed, deeply hollow, the eyes of a man who had not slept properly in days and had spent most of those sleepless hours arriving at this doorstep as the only remaining option. Behind him, half a step back, was Meredith. The white pantsuit was nowhere in evidence. She was wearing an oversized coat that looked borrowed, dark, plain, entirely without the deliberate style that had previously announced her presence in any room. The designer sunglasses were gone. The composure was gone. The dark circles under her eyes were real and unmanaged, and the expression on her face, that precise, cutting certainty I had last seen in a coffee shop, had been completely, thoroughly erased. She looked like a woman who had been humbled by circumstances she had not seen coming and had not yet fully processed. Thaddeus spoke first. His voice cracked on the first word. "Mom." Just that, one word, and everything he needed me to understand was loaded into it. The exhaustion, the shame, the desperation, and underneath all of it, something that might have been genuine remorse, though I had learned by then to examine that particular emotion carefully before accepting it at face value. "Mom, we have nowhere else to go." I stood in the doorway. I did not step back. I did not open the door wider. I held the frame on both sides and I looked at my son and I listened. Then Meredith stepped forward slightly. When she spoke, her voice had none of the smooth, practiced control I remembered from the coffee shop. It was unsteady, stripped, the voice of a woman speaking without a script for possibly the first time in years. "I am so sorry for what I said to you. I was wrong. I was arrogant and I was wrong. We're family, Beatrice. We need you." I looked at them both for a long moment. The snow was coming down steadily around them, settling on Thaddeus's shoulders, catching in Meredith's hair. The porch light made everything sharp and clear and without shadow. I did not feel triumph in that moment. I want to be precise about that, because it would be easy to assume otherwise. What I felt was something more complicated and more honest than triumph. A deep, clear-eyed recognition of how completely a person reaps what they have chosen to sow, and a corresponding steadiness in my own chest that came from knowing I had not planted a single seed of what stood before me. I had simply declined to prevent the harvest. When I spoke, my voice was the same frozen lake voice I had used on the phone with Thaddeus 12 months earlier. Level, warm in register, cold in temperature. "Thaddeus," I said, "I am glad you are physically safe. I mean that without reservation." He exhaled, a shuddering, relieved sound, as though he had expected something harder from the first sentence and had released tension he'd been holding for days. I did not let him hold that relief for long. "But I need you to help me understand something," I continued. "You are standing on my porch telling me you have nowhere else to go, and I am trying to reconcile that with what I was told at a table in a coffee shop not very long ago." His face shifted. "I was told clearly and without ambiguity that my background did not align with your image, that my presence in your lives was an embarrassment, that my lifestyle, my bakery, and everything I represent was something you needed to move away from." I paused. "I was told to stay away. Those were the exact words used. Stay away. We are better off without you." The snow continued to fall between us. I did exactly what was asked of me. I stayed away. I honored that boundary with complete consistency for every day of the time since it was requested. "Mom, I was blinded." His voice broke fully now, the tears on his face real and cold in the December air. "I made a mistake. I let everything. I wasn't thinking clearly. I should never have let any of it happen. I know that. I know it." I looked at my son's face. I felt every year of his life pass through me in the way that only a parent understands. The full weight of a child, from first breath to this moment, carried in a single look. "Thaddeus," I said quietly, "I am not doing anything to you. You are standing here because of a series of calculated decisions that you made with a clear mind and full information. I was not the one who made those decisions. I was simply the one who accepted them." I held his gaze. "You said you were better off without me. I chose to believe you. I gave you exactly what you asked for." Meredith's composure, already fragile, broke at that. "It's freezing out here," she said, and her voice had an edge of the old sharpness returning, the reflex of a woman accustomed to having discomfort removed from her vicinity on demand. "We have been traveling for hours. We are cold and we are exhausted and we have a bag between us. Whatever your feelings are, surely." "I suggest," I said, cutting across her with a gentleness that was more final than any raised voice could have been, "that you find a shelter or a public warmth station. There are several within reasonable distance. I can write down the addresses if that would be helpful. I watched her face process what I had just said. Then I stepped back from the doorway. I closed the door. I turned the deadbolt. The click of it, single, definitive, unhurried, was the loudest sound in the house. I stood for a moment in the hallway with my hand still resting on the deadbolt. Then I walked to the narrow window beside the front door and looked through the glass. They were still standing on the porch. Thaddeus had his head down. Meredith was very still, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, staring at the closed door with an expression I could not fully read from that angle, but that contained, I thought, the particular quality of a person confronting the full consequence of their choices for the very first time. They stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then Thaddeus put his hand gently on Meredith's shoulder, and they turned, and they walked down the porch steps and into the dark together. I watched until they were gone from the reach of the porch light. Then I went back to the kitchen, and I finished preparing the morning's bakery orders. We all knew this moment was coming from the beginning of this story. But did you expect me to close that door? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I have seen this story divide a room right down the middle. After I finished the morning's bakery orders, I washed my hands at the kitchen sink, dried them on the dish towel that hangs from the oven handle, and walked to the sitting room. I turned on the lamp beside my armchair. I added 2 logs to the fireplace and watched the flames take hold of them with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who has nowhere else to be. I made a fresh cup of chamomile tea. I picked up the novel I had been working through for the past 2 weeks, a history of the American Southwest that a friend from my book club had recommended, and I settled into my chair. The house smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the morning's prep work still hanging in the air from the kitchen. It smelled like my life, built by my hands, undisturbed. People have asked me, when I have told pieces of this story to close friends over the years, what I felt that night after I closed the door. They expect one of 2 answers, either the cold satisfaction of revenge delivered or the quiet guilt of a mother who turned her child away in the snow. I felt neither. What I felt, and I have sat with this long enough to trust the description, was peace. Not the fragile, temporary peace that comes from winning an argument or proving a point. The deep, structural peace that comes from having lived in complete alignment with your own values throughout an extended and genuinely painful situation. I had not been cruel. I had not manipulated. I had not plotted or schemed or taken any action designed to cause harm. I had simply done the one thing they had asked of me, consistently and without exception. I had stayed away. And in staying away, I had protected the one thing no one could take from me, my own integrity. 7 months after the night at the door, a letter arrived in my mailbox. A physical letter, handwritten on plain white paper in Thaddeus's handwriting, the same slightly oversized print he had used since he was 12 years old, and that I would recognize anywhere. There was no return address on the envelope, but I knew it was from him before I opened it. It was 4 pages long. I will not reproduce it here in full, because some things belong only to the people they were written for, but I will tell you what it was and what it was not. It was not a request for money. It was not a request to move back into my life on any particular timetable or under any specific conditions. It did not minimize what had happened or dress it in softening language. It was an acknowledgement. A full, clear-eyed, detailed accounting of the choices he had made and the harm those choices had caused, written by a man who had spent 7 months sitting with the unobstructed weight of his own decisions and had arrived, finally, at honesty. I read it twice. Then I set it on the kitchen table and I sat with it for a long time. I wrote back, a shorter letter, 2 pages in my own hand. I told him that I loved him. I told him that I had never stopped loving him, not for a single day of the silence between us. I told him that the door to a rebuilt relationship was not closed, but that it would be rebuilt slowly, on honest foundations, with both of us understanding clearly what had happened and why. I also told him something that I believe with my whole heart, and that I want to pass along to every person watching this. Forgiveness is for your own heart. It is not a favor you extend to the person who wronged you. It is the decision to stop carrying their weight inside your own chest. But forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. And it is not the same as pretending I did not learn what I learned about my son during that year. Meredith and Thaddeus separated approximately 4 months after the night at my door. I was not surprised. Their relationship had been constructed on a specific set of conditions: wealth, status, the social infrastructure of her family's world. And when those conditions ceased to exist, the relationship had nothing underneath them to stand on. Some marriages are built on love that survives the removal of every external comfort. Theirs, it became clear, was not that kind of marriage. She returned to Chicago. I have no information about her current circumstances, and I have not sought any. What happens to Meredith from this point forward is entirely her own story to live, and I wish her, with complete sincerity, the particular growth that only comes from confronting the full consequences of how you have treated people. That is not a cruel wish. It is an honest one. Vance's Sweet Corner is thriving. The wholesale line now runs in 11 regional supermarket locations across 3 states. I hired a full-time manager last spring, which means I can choose my hours at the bakery rather than being required by them. A distinction that, at 72, feels like genuine luxury. I have a book club on Thursday evenings. I have a garden that smells of lavender from May through September. I have friends who have sat at my kitchen table for decades, and who call on my birthday before 8 in the morning without fail. My life is full. It is full of people and things that earn their place in it through consistency, honesty, and genuine care. That is not a small thing. That is everything. If this story has taught me anything worth passing on, it is this. A mother's love is patient. It will wait through silence and distance and deliberate exclusion with a steadiness that most people will never fully understand until they become parents themselves. But patience is not the same as permission. My patience was never an invitation to treat me as something less than I am. It was never a signal that my boundaries did not exist or that my self-respect was negotiable. And a safety net is not the same as a doormat. You can love someone completely, without reservation, and still refuse to be the surface they wipe their feet on. Those two things have always been able to exist in the same heart, at the same time. Mine is proof of that. Now I want to step out of the story for a moment and speak to you directly. Not as Beatrice the narrator, not as the woman standing at the door in the December snow, just as someone who has lived long enough to have earned a few things worth saying, and who believes that a story without a lesson is just entertainment, and entertainment alone was never quite enough for me. So if you will give me a few more minutes, I want to tell you what I actually learned from the hardest year of my adult life. Not the broad strokes. The specific, honest, applicable things that I carry with me now and that I believe will serve you if you let them. The first thing I learned is the difference between loving someone and enabling them, and how easy it is to spend years believing you are doing the first when you are actually doing the second. I loved Thaddeus without condition. I still do. But somewhere along the way, love without condition became support without consequence, and support without consequence became a system that taught my son, without either of us fully realizing it, that the people who love you most are the people you can afford to treat the worst. That is not love's fault. Love itself is not the problem. The problem is when love refuses to hold a boundary because it is afraid that boundaries look like rejection. They do not. A boundary is not a wall built to keep someone out. It is a standard built to make clear what you will and will not accept into your life. Those are entirely different structures, and one of them is an act of love too. The second thing I learned is that dignity under pressure is the rarest and most powerful thing a person can possess. When Meredith sat across from me in that coffee shop and delivered her verdict, the expected response, the culturally scripted response, was either tears or anger. A scene, something she could point to later as confirmation of her assessment of me. I gave her neither, not because I didn't feel anything, but because I understood, in that moment, that my response was the only thing in that room that belonged entirely to me. She could take my seat at the wedding table. She could take my Sunday dinners and my phone calls and my son's easy use of the word mom. She could not take the way I chose to carry myself out of that coffee shop. Nobody can take that from you, ever. How you behave when you are being treated badly is entirely, permanently yours. The third lesson is perhaps the hardest one and the most important. Let people carry the full weight of their own choices. Not out of cruelty, not out of revenge, but out of the deep, genuine understanding that when you rush to absorb the consequences of someone else's decisions, when you rescue, cover, and cushion before the lesson has had time to land, you are not helping them. You are preventing them from becoming the person that difficulty would have made them. Thaddeus needed to sit in the full weight of what he had chosen. Not forever, not beyond what was necessary, but long enough for it to mean something. Long enough for the letter that arrived 7 months later to be written from a place of real understanding rather than temporary inconvenience. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. The kindest thing you can do is not get in their way. And here is what all 3 of those lessons add up to, distilled into the truest thing I know. The best revenge is not loud. It is not dramatic. It does not require a confrontation, a speech, or a single raised voice. The best revenge is simply giving people exactly what they asked for, and then stepping back and letting them live in it. That is what I did, and it worked with a precision that no argument, no ultimatum, and no amount of anger ever could have matched. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done? If you had been standing at that door on that December night, with the snow coming down and your son on the porch, would you have opened it? Tell me honestly in the comments. Guilty or not guilty? No wrong answers. I have read enough of life to know that this question does not have a simple one. Some of you will say I went too far. Some will say I didn't go nearly far enough. But all of you, every single one of you, know she was right. And deep down, if you are being fully honest with yourself, you know you would have closed that door too. This is Beatrice Vance, signing off from Sycamore Lane in Dayton, Ohio. I am going to finish my chamomile tea, check on the lavender before the temperature drops tonight, and sleep the sleep of a woman whose conscience is completely clear. I want to thank you for sitting with this story from beginning to end. You gave it your time, and time is the one thing none of us can make more of. I do not take that lightly, and I never will. Before you go, next time, I am going to tell you about a grandmother who spent 30 years building a family business from nothing, only to watch her own children sign it away behind her back while she was in the hospital. What they did not know was that she had been planning for exactly that possibility for the past decade. Stay close. If this story found you at the right moment, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear it today. The next story drops soon. Subscribers hear it first. Don't be the last to know. If Beatrice's story moved you, hit that like button. Let the right people find it. Every story on this channel is for the ones who stayed quiet too long and finally decided enough was enough. If that is you, you belong here. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And if you are still not subscribing, I genuinely want to know why. Drop it in the comments. No judgment, no pressure. Just tell me what is holding you back, and I will read every single response. Because on this channel, the conversation does not end when the story does. It is just getting started. I will see you in the next one. Beatrice.